And when I was backing out of the driveway, backing up, looking out of the corner of my eye to see traffic coming. And once I pulled out and started to go forward, my vision just went double. Just bam. And I knew something's not right.
My mother, Jennifer, has had the condition multiple sclerosis for almost 8 years. Multiple sclerosis is considered immune-mediated. The immune system attacks the central nervous system. However, it is considered by others an autoimmune disease, in which the immune system treats normal antigens essentially as foreign. Whether MS is immune-mediated or autoimmune is still debated. In multiple sclerosis, the immune system causes damage to the myelin, the fatty sheath that covers and protects nerve fibers, oligodendrocytes that produce myelin, and nerve fibers. I have known about MS for 8 years. I decided it was time to do my part to spread awareness, and maybe even learn a little more for myself in the process.
Oh, it was a Friday, I remember, because I was here at home cleaning and doing all that stuff, and my vision had felt weird for a few days, but I thought maybe it was just, my sinuses were bothering me, something like that. Aunt Linda came over, met us at the house after I got you from school with Jacqueline, and Jacqueline, your cousin, stayed here with you, and then she took me to the ER and went through all of the testing that they did. We think it's just an eye muscle thing. Go see an ophthalmologist.
Okay, so you went to the ophthalmologist then? How long did it take after that for them to figure out what was really going on?
It was like a couple of weeks, I want to say, because that happened Friday. Went to the ophthalmologist Monday. The ophthalmologist said, what you have is a sixth nerve palsy, which is the longest nerve that runs from your eye to your brain, I think, if I remember correctly. And she said, this is really common in children and people with diabetes, but you're not a kid and you don't have diabetes, so there's something else going on. I want you to have an MRI. So a couple of days later, I went and had the MRI. They sent the results to my primary care doctor, who said, it looks like it's MS. You need to go see a neurologist.
So that was pretty much, did you know at that point that it was MS, or was it more of a, it's probably MS?
No, it was probably MS, because then I went to the neurologist, and he said, it could be MS, it could be Lyme disease, it could be, what's that other one? Lupus. It could be all of these things. So here's 4 or 5 different tests that we want to do on you to see if it's any of these things. And your father and I thought, this is pretty serious, we should get a second opinion just to make sure. So that's when he called John and got Dr. Kinkle's name, and we went and saw him. And he looked at my MRIs and he said, no, it's not MS yet, but it will be. You know, you don't have enough lesions yet. And he goes, but you will. He goes, it's not lupus. It's not Lyme disease. He goes, this guy's just, charging you for extra tests that you don't really need.
So he basically said you had MS, but it hadn't fully developed yet?
Hadn't fully developed yet.
Okay.
And that's when he said, we can wait and see what happens, or we can put you on medication now to try to prevent anything terrible from happening.
What type of MS do you have?
It's called relapse remissive, which means you can have an incident like I did with my vision that lasts several weeks, but it clears up and there's no, how is it that they put it? No, like, residual effects, like, your vision isn't permanently damaged. It went back to normal. And and you can go years between incidents and things that will happen.
The type of MS that my mother has is the most common. Secondary progressive MS follows relapsing remitting MS. Most people with relapsing remitting will transition to secondary progressive. This type is a more steady progression with or without relapses. Primary progressive MS is neurological function becoming steadily worse from the start. There may be plateaus or small temporary improvements, but there are no relapses or remissions. Progressive relapsing MS is a steady progression with some exacerbations or attacks. There may or may not be recovery after attacks. There are no relapses or remissions.
The first medication, all of my medications have been injections that I had to learn how to do myself. The first one was once a week medication, and I was on that I would say somewhere between 6 months to a year, and they, said you've still got activity after seeing other MRIs. You still have activity going on. We're going to try a different medication, which was, I want to say every day I had to do that one. And that one wasn't working, and they said on top of that medication, we're going to do, I think it was called an IGIF, I think. It was where they take the plasma of blood and inject it into yours. That's when I had to have those, when the nurse came.
Yep, I remember that.
Yeah, the nurse came. The first one I had to go into Boston and have done because they want to make sure you don't have any allergic reactions, anything bad. After that, I had them all. Yeah, I had them all. Traveling nurse came to the house, and I got to do them here, which was nicer because I could just sack out on the couch and watch TV. Those didn't really do anything, so they said, we would like to try Rebif, which is what I'm on now, which is 3 times a week. It's stronger, and we have better results from it. And that's been, wow, how many years have I been on Rebif now? 3 or 4, I think. Yep. And that has worked successfully.
Okay.
That my MRIs are now, woo, clear, party time after I get them done.
Which is a good thing.
It's an awesome thing.
I was able to set up a visit to the Accelerated Cure Project headquarters in Waltham. I interviewed CEO Robert McBurney and learned more about their mission, projects such as the repository, and more.
I think that the mission of the project is the mission of Accelerated Cure Project, which is starting with diagnosis, to improve diagnosis, because we all know that it's very hard to diagnose multiple sclerosis. It wouldn't be great if there was just a simple blood test that could say you have multiple sclerosis, you don't, you have something else. So to improve diagnosis, to optimize treatment, and to cure MS. So optimizing treatment means that, 20 years ago, there were no treatments for multiple sclerosis. So the first new drug treatment was approved in, I think it was June 1993, so just 20 years ago. Today, thanks to all of the efforts of researchers and the pharmaceutical companies, we have 10 different treatments of 7 different mechanisms, which you might think is a great victory. But most people who begin treatment for multiple sclerosis find that it doesn't work, and they move on to the next treatment. And then sometimes that doesn't work, and they move on to the next treatment. And all of this time, what's happening is you're losing time, money. These are very expensive treatments, so someone is paying for the very expensive treatments, health insurance mostly, and you're losing brain. And so not being able to get people on the right treatment first up is a great disappointment. And that's part of optimizing treatment. And finally, to cure MS is enormously important, obviously. But how many MSs are there? We don't know. So one of the goals of the project as well is to try and define the disease. Now we already know that some parts of multiple sclerosis are now separated out into separate diseases. There's a rare disease called neuromyelitis optica, which is defined now by antibodies in your blood to a particular protein called aquaporin 4. And so that means that something that was part of multiple sclerosis now is a completely separate disease that responds differently to treatment, and it's known that disease responds differently to treatment. Well, how many other of those diseases are there within multiple sclerosis? Because no one seems to have exactly the same multiple sclerosis. We know that people don't respond all exactly to the same drugs. And so that probably suggests already, there's a clue, that there's probably more than one disease. So part of what we're doing in getting all of these samples and data is trying to help to define how many MSs there are. And then maybe our ability, once we've diagnosed those different MSs, to treat them properly, and maybe even to cure some of them, will come about. So the founder of Accelerated Cure Project was Art Meller, and Art wife was an MIT graduate who probably hadn't thought very much about biomedical research. He was an entrepreneur, he'd started some companies, and then one day he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And then he started thinking about MS, and he started thinking about biomedical research. And he had been involved in the software and hardware industry. And he knew what effect open source movement had on the development of software. And he took a look at the world of biomedical research and said, you know, these people don't really share. And I want to create an organization that's going to promote sharing, because that's the way that research will go faster. And so that's why it's today called the Accelerated Cure Project. Originally it was called the Boston Cure Project. And I don't know whether people thought that Boston needed curing, but it's a much better name, Accelerated Cure Project for multiple sclerosis. And that's how it got started. Okay. In the early days, they weren't experts in multiple sclerosis, so they took a long time to learn about the disease. And then they had a very bright idea, and that was to create the repository.
Okay, what is the repository?
I knew I'd wait for a pause there. So the repository, their way of accelerating research was to realize that, and I'm going to paraphrase the world of research, as if it were an animal kingdom.
Okay.
Right? So at one end of this animal kingdom you have lions, which are the leaders in the field. They control a lot of the clinical sites. They control a lot of the biological samples and data. And at the other end of the animal kingdom of research, there are the squeaky mice. And the squeaky mice probably have most of the good ideas, but they don't control any of the clinical samples, the biological materials. And you should look up what Margaret Mead said, and you probably had this quote somewhere, about how a small group can change the world. And so Art Miller and the other founders decided that the best thing they could do was enable the squeaky mice by providing the squeaky mice with the resources that they need to do the research that would generate new information and drive towards cures for the disease.
Okay.
So the repository turns out to be a collection of biological samples and data from over 3,200 people who have donated their blood samples and data at 10 clinical sites around the United States. It was a brilliant idea, and those samples are given out to researchers all around the world. So whether you're an academic or whether you're in industry, whether you are a squeaky mouse or you're a lion, you can get access to the Accelerated Cure Project samples with one proviso. Well, there are two provisos. You pay a little bit, far less than it costs for us to get the samples. You pay a little bit, but you agree that if you make measurements on the biological samples, that at some date in the future that allows for you to protect what's called intellectual property, you give the data back to Accelerated Cure Project for the benefit of everybody. I am a neuroscientist by background, and I spent the last few years doing research in a variety of disorders in the nervous system, ranging from muscle and nerve disorders, pain, Alzheimer's disease, stroke, traumatic brain injury, and multiple sclerosis. And I've been involved in starting companies and working for companies started by other people. When I was approached about Accelerated Cure Project, and I looked at what Accelerated Cure Project had done, I was just blown away. And I had never heard of Accelerated Cure Project. I think one of the problems we have with Accelerated Cure Project is we're not very well known. And that's part of the mission for the future, is to make us better known, because being better known means that more patients will want to contribute. It means more researchers will want to take the samples and do work, and it means just more people will want to support us as well. But at that time, I had never heard of Accelerated Cure Project. I was just blown away by what had been achieved, and I was particularly excited by the model, by the way they were going about accelerating research. It wasn't just about collecting some donor funds and giving it to individual research projects. So I mentioned that we maybe have created $80 million worth of research value and saved 400 years of research time. We've done that by creating the repository at a cost of around about $14 million. So actually in 6 years, we've leveraged that $14 million investment to create $80 million of value. So that's not a bad return even in the investment world. And so that's the sort of thing that I just went, wow, this is an organization I want to be part of. And interestingly enough, they were interested in having me too. Yeah. There are about 80, there are actually 77 right at this moment. 77 research studies that have been done, that are being done or have been done all around the world. I think Israel to Australia is the biggest span. One of the very interesting things about the data that's being returned is that because we know the identifiers, anonymous identifiers of every person who's donated a sample, we can look to see which data is about the same people. Where we have about 25 of those data sets returned, about 300 million data points, which is a fairly large number.
Yeah.
But we have billions of data points still to come. And one of the most exciting things about this is that we find that the data from one group is being obtained on the same group of patients as the data from another group. Now this is like creating a virtual collaboration. If you have, so we've had about 25 data sets returned, and maybe 10 of them involve the same patients. So that's more information than anyone has ever known about that group of patients, which is pretty exciting. But also, it's as if 10 different groups around the world were working together. Now, if you had to create that collaboration by getting all of those groups and their universities or companies to agree to work together, you'd probably be losing 400 years rather than gaining 400 years. But simply by creating the repository and this requirement that data is returned to a central database, you're creating these virtual collaborations that are actually bringing some of the best and brightest together, even though they don't know it, at least until the data comes back. So it's a pretty interesting model. I think it's great.
What are some of the other major accomplishments? I know you already mentioned the repository, which is a huge thing, but what are some of the other big things that have happened?
Well, actually there are some diagnostic tests that are in development today because of the repository. And there's one of our investigators that, whose name is Thomas Owen at Vanderbilt University, who's developed a test, a blood test for multiple sclerosis, and it's currently with a commercial company in Seattle, Washington. And so that's something we're really excited about because, as we said, if there can be simpler tests for multiple sclerosis that really can put people into a class of multiple sclerosis or eliminate them from multiple sclerosis and put them in a class of some other disease, that would be wonderful. I'd like to share with you one of the things that Thomas Owen said.
Okay.
Okay? And I didn't know this until someone alerted us to a Scientific American blog article written by a reporter who was doing a piece on multiple sclerosis. And then she found Thomas Owen and wrote a piece on largely about Accelerated Cure Project. And what he said was, working with them, meaning us, Accelerated Cure Project, allowed us to obtain critical samples and confirm our results about this diagnostic for only $20,000, which sounds like a lot of money, except he said, if I had to obtain these samples from scratch, it would have cost $1 million and added 5 years to the project. So that's a pretty big accomplishment.
Yeah.
Now, if you think that we have supported almost 80 studies worldwide with these samples and data, and if the same thing is true for all of those 80 studies, then completely separately from whether we're on the path to a cure or better diagnosis or better treatments, you could say we've created $80 million worth of research value and saved 400 years of research time.
That's a lot of years.
Yeah. So I think that's an achievement by itself.
What are some other future plans for the project, upcoming things?
Okay, so two very important things. The first is, so we've created this repository that represents 3,200 or more people. We've given out the samples to almost 80 research groups worldwide, and now we're beginning to get the data back. So far, 25 groups have returned data. And if you like to think it this way, the path to improving diagnosis, optimizing treatment, and curing MS has to go through a comprehensive understanding of what's the difference between people with MS and people with other diseases and otherwise healthy people. And that comprehensive understanding represents as much information as you can gain. Well, people are just flooding information back to us now. And the one problem we have, and this is the answer to your question in part, the one problem we have is how do we let people know about all of this data?
Yeah.
So we're actually working on a very exciting way of visualizing what's in our database. You know, how the different data sets overlap, so that people can use that information to choose just the samples they want, or to choose a data collection they want for analysis. You've heard about big data. Everybody talks about big data now. Big data, big data. Well, actually, Accelerated Cure Project is collecting big data about people with multiple sclerosis. And let me tell you one more thing, okay? So I mentioned the fact that we have 10 drugs of 7 different mechanisms,
Yep.
and we don't know which drug is good for which person. So we actually stopped getting samples and data into the repository in the way we were doing it before. And we're currently putting together a major clinical study, not just to find out what the causes and mechanisms of multiple sclerosis are, but really to find out the characteristics of patients that respond to particular treatments. So getting the right treatment to the right patient at the right time. And this study will look at people over a long period of time and look at what they're treated with, look at their outcomes, but be able to collect the baseline data and biological samples that will allow us to develop not diagnostic tests for multiple sclerosis, but predictive tests of what sort of treatment they'll respond to. And that study involves 3,500 patients, so it will double the amount of samples and data in the repository. And it's only going to cost $35 million.
It's a pretty big amount, big amount.
Yes, it is. But I think it's one of the most exciting things that Accelerated Cure Project has done,
Yeah.
Beyond create the original repository. So it's a very exciting time for us right now, and I hope that in the next few months you'll read about someone coming up with support for this very large clinical study, because there's a lot of interest in the study.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't have been possible for us to run a study like that unless we had 10 clinical sites around the United States where we had, if you like, a well-oiled machine for sample and data acquisition. So essentially we have a clinical trial network that we've created on the way to creating this resource in the repository.
And it's amazing research. When we went in and you interviewed the CEO, I was just floored because I knew they were doing research, but I didn't know the level that they
were
had
doing
taken
that.
it to. Yeah.
What was your experience? You tried to submit some sort of sample for research.
Yeah.
but you couldn't, right?
Yeah, I tried to do it with the accelerated cure because they were just taking, I think it was like blood samples and family histories, but they had filled their data bank. They had all the samples they needed, so.
What was your experience like with the insurance companies and getting money for treatments and medication, appointments, etc.?
We are very lucky. We are very lucky in that your father works for EMC, and EMC has really excellent insurance, that we've never had a problem as far as getting coverage on my medications or my appointments or anything. The only problem we ever had was one time the health insurance decided that I didn't need to be on Rebif, the medication I'm on. They said, we have this other one, Avonex. It's the same thing. It works just as well and it's cheaper. It's in the same family of drugs. It doesn't work as well, I know, because that was the first medication I was on that didn't work. And they were going to stop sending me the Rebif and just send me the Avonex. And we had to get my neurologist involved and to call them or write a letter and say,
It's not going to work.
no, you cannot do this. You cannot just change medications. It doesn't work like that. And there was a little bit of resistance, but in the end, you know,
It worked out.
Yeah, it worked out and it was fine, and they've never tried to do that again.
That's good.
It is good.
I also discussed insurance as well as other aspects with my father, Michael.
So, the complexity in the insurances are, among other things, the fact that it's not a terribly well-known disorder. So when you talk to folks, they make a lot of assumptions that don't necessarily apply. The treatments, you know, we have the lab tests like the MRI and the neurologist visits as well. The treatments are largely prescription drugs, but what's interesting is that some of those medications are administered in a hospital setting, such as IVIG, and or in a home setting, but requiring professional services from nurses and the like. And so as a consequence, there can be some challenges with the insurance companies themselves, particularly if, as we have, there's a different insurer for prescription medications than there are for medical issues.
Yep.
And so they get into a little bit of a fight about who it is that's going to pay for what. So you have to kind of work through those things. The other thing is that because primarily the first medications were considered orphan drugs, which is a policy the United States put into place, I believe, in 1983, that it basically encourages companies to develop medications and treatments for diseases that have a relatively small percentage of the population. And what they do is they offer them incentives and they offer them favorable policies with respect to patents for an extended period of time. What that means is because of the research costs and those protections, there's no generic equivalents, and so the medications can be very expensive. You know, some of the therapies come on the market and cost $15,000 a year at their regular price, and so you know the insurance companies are very careful when they do the reviews they try to find something that's cost effective, sometime at the expense of efficacy. And the challenge that we faced was trying to find the right treatment, and then once the right treatment was found, arguing with the insurance companies that in fact we weren't going to change back to something that hadn't been effective simply because the cost profile was more palatable to them. Ran into some interesting things. I mentioned the IVIG. That's a treatment that's not completely standard. Our neurologist thought that it might work and wanted to try it for a course of 6 months in combination with another medication, and we had to have some interesting conversations with the insurance company about that. And then ideally we didn't want to have it administered. It was a once-a-month treatment. Didn't have to go to Boston all the time. Work through the challenges of trying to get the administration done at the house. In the end, the first session had to be done in Boston. Subsequent ones were done here, and the later treatments were begun by a nurse but actually ended by us. So I actually removed the IV and got rid of the remaining, the waste products and stuff, the IV bag and all that stuff on our own with a special box they had given us to send back. The other thing that's interesting is that the way prescription drugs are covered, varies from policy to policy and even within policy. So we've had some challenges at different times when they've decided, what the share that we'll pay is. Sometimes it's a percentage of the total cost of the drug up to a certain copay. Other times they had flat rates, and over the course of the last 7.5 years, that's changed a couple of times as well. And so you just kind of have to stay on top of it.
Do you know if overall the general experience that people have with an insurance and money is similar to ours, or is it more difficult?
It depends on the insurer.
Okay.
I'd argue that we're relatively fortunate. We have a fairly strong insurance policy that has a reasonable degree of coverage. Even then, there were certain coordination issues. There were problems working between the insurance company, the doctor's office, the medication company. When we got the medication, the very first one that Mom was on required a degree of training. They come in and teach you how to administer it to yourself. But they didn't have anybody in the area to do it. They tried to refer us back to the insurance company, who said that's on the drug company, those sorts of things. But in the end, with some diligence from ourselves and frankly some assistance from EMC as well, we got those issues cleared up. Not everybody's that fortunate, and different insurance companies cover different treatments. There are a relatively standard set of treatments available to MS patients today. The drugs that have been around longer, things like Avonex, Copaxone, Rebif, those ones seem to be, from the limited number of folks I've had the opportunity to talk to, pretty straightforward. Some of the more recent ones, some of the oral medications, because they're relatively new and because as a consequence they're also very expensive, people are having trouble getting a hold of. Again, because the therapy that Mom has been on has been effective for her. We haven't faced those challenges, so we don't know whether we'd have them or not. But I think there's a fairly broad-based and somewhat differentiated experience. The other thing that's interesting is that the individual drug companies offer different programs to help deliver the medicines to folks who don't have the ability to pay for it themselves. So there's certainly not a one-size-fits-all kind of an experience.
Obviously, it's complicated and it's difficult to diagnose.
Very.
And a lot of times there's misunderstandings about it because of that, for other various reasons. And I know that you have had issues with that before. What examples do you have of people not understanding and it sort of causing an issue?
My primary care doctor didn't really understand anything about MS. I mean, when he got the MRI results and then called me and said, you need to come in with your husband, he said, well, it looks like MS, this is what MS is, and blah, 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 and people get it and then they die. And it was like, well, what am I supposed to do? And he said, well, go home, and call, a neurologist and this, that, and the other thing. So a lot of people don't understand. That's why you have to go see a specialist, somebody who, knows this field and knows what they're doing. Because once I got in with Dr. Kinkle, my first neurologist, it was, oh, okay, I don't really have anything to worry about. I'm not going to die. Nothing bad is going to happen.
So it can be more serious for some people,
Yes.
but one of the misunderstandings then is that it's consistently always a serious thing. You should always be terrified, but that's not the case.
That is absolutely not the case. I think that is. The people who know what MS is and know people who have MS are like, oh, it's not a big deal. You're fine. Whereas people who don't know anything about MS and don't know people with MS think, oh my God, well, how much longer do you have? When are you going to have to be in a wheelchair all the time? And when, well, it's been almost 8 years and
Yep.
I'm fine.
And you've had that experience a lot with family and friends. Do you ever feel like they just aren't getting it? They aren't understanding or listening to what you're saying about what's happening?
Absolutely. Especially when I was first diagnosed, it was really, really difficult because I would get from a lot of people, well, how much longer do you have? Like, well, how much longer do I have for what? I don't have an expiration date stamped on the bottom of my foot, Well, how much longer till you need a wheelchair? I don't know. I might not never need to be in a wheelchair or anything like that,
Yeah.
You never know.
I was telling you the story earlier about a friend of mine who is on a board with me, And he came to me one day and said, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. I had multiple sclerosis once. And I said, once. And he told me the story about the fact that he thought he had multiple sclerosis for years because he'd been given a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. But ultimately, a neurologist friend of his found that he actually had Lyme disease. So there are people that are diagnosed with multiple sclerosis that turn out to have some other disease, but they may not know for a long period of time, and it may completely change their lives during this period while they don't know. And then there are other people that don't know they have multiple sclerosis for very long periods of time. You know, they can, for example, have weakness in a certain part of their body, or they can, particularly one of the things is they can get very fatigued in warm weather, because there's a general effect of body temperature on the ability of your nerves to conduct nerve impulses. And in the case where you have what's called demyelination in multiple sclerosis, where the insulation outside individual nerve fibers is broken down or damaged by the immune system, then the nerve impulses fail, and that's why you have weakness or lack of sensation or even tingling in various parts of the body. And but you may think that this is some sort of natural event, and you just may go on for years not feeling so great. And then something will happen. Unfortunately, it's usually something quite bad that happens that's a little bit more extreme than other experiences you've had with the disease, and you end up getting a diagnosis. And so I've given you two examples, one where you can get the diagnosis and you don't have the disease, another one where you can have the disease and you don't have a diagnosis for a very long period of time. And if you don't have a diagnosis, you don't have any treatment.
I know that not just general media, but there's been TV shows that have said things. I remember there was a specific one like years ago, and I can't remember what show it was.
Oh, it was the one that had Tim Roth in
Was it Lie to Me?
Lie to Me. That there was some case going on and there was something wrong with this guy and he was not being honest, and so they were watching the videos of this guy and what was happening, and all of a sudden there was this minute little, he had this tiny little eye twitch. Oh my God, he's in the last phases of MS. And it was like,
Overly dramatic.
what? You can tell that from some grainy video.
And that just belittles a lot of things. It belittles, it's the last stages.
Right, and what are the last stages of MS? Even the medical
Yeah.
community can tell you, we don't really know. I mean, it depends on what kind of MS and what you're going through.
Yeah.
But you cannot diagnose somebody
Like
from
that.
an eye twitch on a videotape. And that's what ticked me off. I was like, you gotta be joking with me. But they do that. They rely on the fact that people don't know a lot about it, so they can, play it up and make it
Yeah.
as bad as they want.
How has your having MS affected your family and friends?
Well, I think it's hard, especially since my parents live in California and being on the other side of the country. They don't see me every day, so they don't know what is happening, and they're not sure, and so they rely on me to tell them, I'm fine, you have to believe me. If something bad was happening, I would tell you. And at first it caused a lot of tension, that, oh, you're just not telling me everything because you want to protect us and you don't want us to be upset. And no, I'm not trying to protect anybody but myself. I'm fine, If something bad was happening, you would absolutely be told.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, do you have any other thoughts on that or anything? Because I know that it's been a big deal with people that they've said a lot of things to you that were not true.
Right. And yes, and people saying, well, you're going to have to start to make plans for when you're going to need extra care. And it's like, well, I don't need that right now. I mean, maybe sometime in the future, maybe I will get to that. I'm not going to cross that bridge until I get to it,
Yep.
Right now, everything is good. I'm healthy. I'm great. And that's pretty much all that matters to me.
Yep.
Day to day, anybody doesn't know what's going to happen to them.
That's true.
Right. But I think since it's been so long now, people, I've had people tell me like, oh, I don't even think that you have MS. It doesn't even cross my mind. I'm like, well, good. I don't want that to be the first thing people think when they look at me. Like, oh.
Yeah. Do you know of any support groups that would help with overall like emotional, mental support, or
money, insurance, things like that?
I think the MS Society does a lot of work like that. If you
Yep.
need help, they have different avenues. I think you can go to their website, and I think there's a 800 number probably that you can call them and get any kind of help that you might need. I really wish, like, when I stopped taking, I can't remember if it was the Avonex or the second, I can't remember the second medication I was on. Isn't that awful?
No. I don't think it is.
I had all of these supplies, all of this unused medication and unused syringes that were all wrapped up, still sealed. And when they switched me to the new stuff, we said, well, what do we do with this? And they said, well, you just throw it out. Well, I don't want to just throw it
Yeah.
out. Somebody else could use all of this. But because of the laws and health standards, they couldn't
can't.
do that. And I wish there were a way that, you know, you could do something like that. That if you have something that you don't need, you're no longer using, you know, of that nature, you could. But I think there are programs through the MS Society that take care and help people.
Do you know
Yeah.
of specific support groups, I guess mentally and emotionally, but also with money or insurance that are going to help people that
Sure.
have MS and their families?
Sure. So, you know, you did your interview with the Accelerated Cure program. Their primary focus, as I understand it, is on research. I do believe that they've had some, they've helped some folks out, you know, with more sort of palliative care and things as well. National MS Society has programs, and there are a variety of other charities. They have support groups both in terms of helping to provide resources, you know, getting grants, for example, for people to have wheelchairs and ramps installed in their houses, things like that. There are also support groups, you know, meaning, you know, emotional support groups within each of those charities, to the best of my awareness. In addition to that, it's interesting, the hospitals. So Mom's Care comes from Beth Israel. Beth Israel has a support group of its own, as I understand it. So does the Leahy Clinic, I think Mass General. So lots of them will have support groups for their patients. The individual drug companies, at least all of the ones that we've dealt with, have had their own programs for support purposes. Those programs include visiting nurses, and pharmacists and such that you can call up and you can talk about symptoms and experiences that you've been having, but they also have support groups where you can talk about your experiences. They'll have conferences that they'll bring people in, and you know, the latest therapies, the effects that folks are going through, and these sorts of things. So there's actually a fair amount of resource out there. The challenge is finding something that, you know, works for you and your circumstances. It's certainly not a, you know, not everybody has the same experience with the disease, and so as a consequence, the sorts of support people may need is going to differ as well.
Okay.
What is the most important thing that you wish people would know, or that you could say to people about MS, or even about the Accelerated Cure project?
Well, I would say to people about MS, if you have any symptoms that relate to mobility or sensation or thoughts that you don't understand, go see a doctor. And go see a good doctor as well. Not one that will diagnose you with multiple sclerosis when you have Lyme disease. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing to say. But it's difficult, you know, because we all, well, young people don't live with any problems, but all of us old people live with all sorts of niggling problems that we sort of continue to live with. I think it's really important that people talk to other people about their experiences and take advice. And I hope that the healthcare system is moving towards a place where it's easy for people to access it. Because I've lived in 2 other countries where there is single-payer healthcare systems that pretty much work. And the experience here is that healthcare costs are daunting, and if you don't have insurance, that's a problem. Whereas that's not the case in other places. And so that's a very important thing as well, because that creates the landscape on which it's possible for people without a great burden to access the healthcare system. And that's really important for people with MS. We're a sort of strange organisation because we are patient-founded, patient-supported, but we don't really give anything immediate back to patients other than hope, perhaps, because unlike organisations that would provide, the donors would provide a nice comfy chair to sit in while you're having a Tisabri infusion or something like that. We invest in research where the payoff is a long way away, but frankly no real advance in medicine has ever come without research, and so that's why it's so important to accelerate research.
Okay. Is there anything else I have to say? I think probably, there's a wide range for the disease, right? It starts with relapse remitting, it goes through secondary progressive, primary progressive. I've also heard the term progressive relapsing, but I'm not as familiar with that.
Yeah.
Not everybody is going to move from stage to stage. If they do move from stage to stage, the rate at which that happens isn't uniform.
Yeah.
The ultimate triggers are not terribly well understood. There's some thoughts about different things they think might cause it. There are some correlations between vitamin D deficiencies. There are correlations with respect to where in the hemisphere you live. And there's some thought that perhaps exposure to sunshine and the manufacturing of vitamin D, in the northern part of the world or the extreme south, is less exposure to sunlight, and as a consequence, maybe there's some contributing factor there.
Okay.
But there's lots and lots of research going on trying to understand just the various things that may cause this. And we talked about the Accelerated Cure program. What's really interesting, came out in the interview you did before, is that this program is all about collaboration and using data from common sets of folks that can be applied to multiple different disciplines in terms of researching cures. And I think one of the takeaways that folks can make from looking into that is that it's an approach that would be beneficial for lots of diseases. And I heard Bob talk about that, and that's an important point, I think, to emphasize.
Okay. What do you think is the best way to then figure out how to make people understand more or be more aware, since it's just one of those disorders that people don't know much about?
Right.
Versus there are some that people know tons about.
Right. I would tell people to talk to somebody. I mean, if you know somebody that has MS and you don't know a lot, don't jump to conclusions. Talk to them, ask them questions. I think most people with MS would be very open and honest and tell you exactly, what they have problems with, what they don't have problems with, how they would like to be treated. I know I had problems with people like, oh, well, you just don't want to talk about it. I don't mind talking about it. I don't want to talk about when are you going to die, when are you going to be a cripple, when are you going to, no. I didn't want to talk about
more
that.
Straightforward things.
Right. Ask me how I'm feeling.
More
What's
positive.
going on? Are you having any issues with X, Y, and Z? That's what I would, I don't mind talking about that. I don't want to be a fatalist.
Wow. I would say that the events of our last annual dinner or annual recognition event were some of the most moving. We had two brief speeches given, one by an attorney who is at the UMass Medical School practice, and he talked about his experience being diagnosed about 4 years ago with multiple sclerosis. And he talked about this issue that I was prescribed one treatment, and 9 months later my doctor said to me, you flunked, we need to move you on to something else. And then 9 months later, again, you flunked, we need to move you on. And he was on his third treatment in 4 years. And he gave a little talk like that, but the thing that was most moving is at the end of the talk, he pulled out of his pocket a dart, a dice, and a coin. And he said, these are the tools that you can use today to decide what treatment is right for you. we need OPT-UP, which is this 3,500 patient study that stands for Optimizing Treatment and Understanding Progression. He said we need OPT-UP to solve this problem. That was pretty moving. And then the other moving talk was from one of our supporters who's a single mum with 2 children, who talked about how her disorder has really influenced her life and how much she hopes that her children don't experience the disorder. And they were 2 really moving talks. But you know, there are stories like that from people who support Accelerated Cure Project all the time.
Your attitude is 90% of what's going to get you through this. And he goes, but if you keep a positive attitude and, you know, you find things that you like to do and make you happy, that is going to make all of the difference.
Okay.
And I believe that. When I was first diagnosed, I remember thinking that, you know, my whole life led up to this moment, that from that day forward, I remember everything before that was, you know, before MS, when I never worried about anything, and then everything after that would just, our whole lives would be affected, and it was going to be awful. And the truth of the statement is it has not affected us at all. Not, you know, on any grand scale or, you know, proportion like that. That it has kind of, you know, we've had to tweak our schedules a little bit, especially when I have to go in for MRIs or doctor's appointments.
Yeah,
and
we'll
then
do the shots.
And doing the shots, and then when traveling, when I have to take the shots with me. But in the big picture, it has not really affected us at all. And you know, this is going to sound funny, I think it has given me a greater appreciation for my life, because I can look at it before and say all these things that I worried about before now just seem so trivial that, you know, I don't take things for granted as much as I used to, that I'm very thankful for every day and everything I have, and that makes it better.